Hey Dragon Slayers, today's video is about what your fasting insulin should be and some methods for measuring it. If you can only get fasting insulin, try to get your blood glucose measured at the same time. The upside of this is being able to figure out your homeostatic model assessment, also known as the HOMA IR score. This is very, this is a helpful little formula that considers both fasting glucose and fasting insulin by covering both sides of the coin. It's more descriptive than insulin alone. The value is determined mathematically by taking your glucose in milligrams per deciliter, multiplying it by your insulin in microgram, or I think it's micro units by milliliter, and then dividing it by 405. That's in the United States. For other places in the world that use the metric system, it would be your glucose in millimoles per liter times your insulin in microunits per milliliter and divided it by 22.5. Though there is no consensus yet, a value over 1.5 indicates insulin resistance, and above 3 usually means you're on the borderline of having type 2 diabetes. Unfortunately, even fasting insulin may have some limitations. There are people whose fasting insulin might be normal, yet their insulin response to dietary glucose isn't. To understand this, you would have to work with a healthcare professional or research lab. They will have you drink a small cup, 75 grams of pure glucose, and immediately get your blood drawn every 30 minutes for 2 hours. There are a couple of methods to scrutinize insulin, but the simplest way is this. One, if your insulin peaks at 30 minutes and steadily comes down, you're likely insulin sensitive. Two, if your insulin peaks at 60 minutes rather than 30 minutes, be careful, you're probably insulin resistant, and your likelihood of getting type 2 diabetes later in life is 5 times higher than normal. And finally, 3, if your insulin progressively climbs and peaks at 120 minutes, you're most likely insulin resistant, and you're almost 15 times more likely to get type 2 diabetes. So, one note on this, if you have type 2 diabetes and you've been prescribed insulin, you can also track your daily insulin dose as a sign of changes. Ideally, you should be checking your blood glucose levels frequently. If, after making some lifestyle choices, your normal insulin dose is resulting in lower than typical blood glucose levels, that dose has become too high. You're more sensitive to insulin. And be warned, things can change very quickly once you start changing your diet. In fact, one study showed that basically when you take carbohydrate restriction, insulin treated type 2 diabetes patients had to reduce their insulin dose by half within just one day. If you can't easily measure your insulin, there are a couple of alternatives. One is to measure your blood pressure. If you manage to lower your insulin levels, blood pressure should come down within a few days. Two, measure your ketones. By purchasing a ketone meter, you can get an idea of insulin control, albeit directly, insofar as ketones will start to rise as insulin starts to drop. This also might take a few days. You'll recall that a diet that keeps insulin low will also keep ketone production from the liver. It will also increase ketone production in the liver. This process of ketogenesis is normal, even healthy, state where the body is using fat such as at such a high rate that some of the fat is being turned into ketones. Most of the ketones will be used by the body, especially the brain, for energy, but we also expel some in our breath and urine. Because of this, you can measure your ketones in a number of ways. The most accurate and expensive is using a blood ketone test strip, which is around $1 per strip. The cheapest method is using the urine test strips, which cost a few cents each. And the final method is a breath ketone analyzer, which falls between both strip methods in expense. All have pros and cons to consider when deciding to take this route. Many people find it highly motivating to measure ketones to determine how well they are at lowering insulin through their dietary changes. Though this greatly depends on the person, if blood ketones are around 1 millimole, insulin levels are probably below 10 microunits per milliliter, which is a great insulin level to start with. Unfortunately, using ketones as a marker of insulin changes becomes less useful over time. Blood insulin levels may not drop much more, but with ongoing dietary changes, ketones could continually rise slightly. Until an at-home method of measuring insulin is available, this is the easiest do-it-yourself way to get an idea of your insulin. So that's what I've got for you guys today. Don't forget to like and subscribe because it really helps the channel out. And remember, guys, that together, you and I will slay the dreaded diabetes dragon.